This is Jeffrey Tucker, Brownstone Institute. I thought I would use this video to go through my article, which I think is probably the most complete version of the logic or lack of the plan, let's just say, of the pandemic period through the mind of Anthony Fauci. And we know this mainly because of the release of the Diaries. It's given us new insight into exactly why everything fell down the way it did, why the businesses were closed, why the churches were closed, why we went through years of panic of school closures and learning losses and massive disruption, not only in the United States, but all over the world. With Fauci, now I'm not arguing that Fauci was somehow the mastermind of everything, but to some extent, we gain a lot of insight just by looking at his own rationale. My impression I'm left with is that he had a lot more power and decision-making authority than I had previously believed. In fact, there's some ways in which he was a decisive figure throughout the entire thing, not just in public messaging, but in behind the scenes, and plotting out exactly what would transpire over the course of these years. And I've written this in an article for Brownstone called "What Did Fauci Mean by Game On?" That remark, "Game On," comes pretty early on in the Diaries. And when I first read it, I thought, well, I wonder what game he's referring to. What you say "game on" when you're about to start a big battle, the unfolding of a big plan. So what did he mean? And I've tried to flesh it out in this piece, and I want to kind of talk you through this just a little bit. But in order to understand the earlier period, we have to go back to the period of the lab leak itself. So Fauci had been at work for years, working with other colleagues, cooperating with the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and getting them money through a third-party EcoHealth Alliance to conduct gain-of-function research. Now, lab leaks are very common. There are hundreds of them on record. We know this. So it's not exactly an unusual thing. But this one became worrisome because in October, there was the military games in Wuhan where servicemen and women from the U.S. and all over the world competed in Wuhan, and many returned reporting of a very debilitating flu that lasted and lasted. That in itself is maybe a little bit unusual that everybody would catch the flu in Wuhan. This would have been mid-October of 2019. But what was particularly strange, there were two strange features of this. One was that the Chinese authorities in Wuhan was very careful in controlling exposure. So the highways were largely empty. People were staying home. There was something, as far as anybody could tell, that was a little bit strange, something even ominous that was transpiring during this period, almost as if the Chinese authorities knew that something was up. Well, the returning soldiers, and I've spoken to some of them, reported a terrible flu. This would have been, the wild type of the virus, most likely. But the response from their authorities was essentially to shut up about it. Don't go home to families. You need to quarantine for a period. You're going to stay in this hotel room for a period of days and weeks. And don't tell anybody what's going on. Don't report it. And it was very strange for the servicemen who were afflicted with this thing to be essentially shut down like this way, and they didn't know why this was true. They were highly suspicious, and I've talked to some of these people on the phone about it very early on, and they were very concerned about this. Now, I'm assuming that this was the period in which essentially the cat was out of the bag, that military intelligence, and most likely Anthony Fauci knew that there was a lab leak of this virus, most likely this coronavirus, on which they had been working for some years. So There was a matter of waiting game for Fauci throughout this entire period. That he didn't know whether this would come out in public. There was a genuine possibility that maybe it would never hit the news. Maybe it would just come and go and nobody would ever know. I think most lab leaks, this is what happens. Maybe some people get sick, but it doesn't become a pandemic and it doesn't become public. So this was probably his original hope that he carried from October, November, and December. This begins to change in early January, and this is when the diary starts. On January 3rd, he reports pretty early on that there is a problem, that there's a virus, that China is reporting a virus, and his entry says 44 unusual cases of pneumonia in Wuhan, China over the past couple of days. Etymology still unknown. Etiology still unknown. Said to be a viral pneumonia of unknown etiology. Flu ruled out. Cases linked to seafood market. No human to transmission documented at this time. So this was January 3rd. Also on January 3rd, he maps out what I believe was what I'm calling his plan A. A plan A was to warn of a coming really bad flu season. And he does this on this very day. When he reads about these unusual cases, he's suspicious that maybe he would bear some responsibility for this. So he deployed Plan A, which was the hope that this new virus would just kind of get lost in the mix, that we don't have real testing for it, that it would just be seen as yet another flu. So immediately he goes to the airwaves and starts warning about flu. He arranges interviews all over the place, and on this very day, January 3rd, he starts writing in his diary that the influenza is heavy in the media. I'm doing interviews all about the coming flu. This is very bad. The flu is going to be terrible. And he devotes the next several days to doing this, all the way through January 7th, January 10th. He writes, the influenza is hot and heavy. This is very bad. We don't really have a vaccine for it. So he's already generating a kind of a public alarm about this. So you can see what's happening here. He's like, okay, if this comes here, we have a bad flu season. If nothing happens, I'm no worse off. I will have warned the public about a bad flu. If the bad flu does come, then I can say I've warned about it. So this is, I think, his very first plan. And this was all going well until a week after the initial announcement. This would have been on January 10. He puts in all bold in his diary, the Chinese have published a sequence of the virus on a public database. Now, they were charging for this, obviously. Whoever got the sequence of the virus was making you pay a fee to get it, but it was out there. So he's very intensely watching this. He becomes aware of this. So now it's the weekend, and he calls up a guy, Professor Barney Graham. Now, who is that? Well, he's a professor of microbiology at Morehouse School of Medicine in Atlanta, and which is the home of the CDC. And he's formerly the deputy director of the Vaccine Research Center, which is part of Fauci's NIAID. He is also the holder of 38 patents related to immunizations in particular. One of them was granted in 2017, prefusion corona spike proteins and their use. So Fauci knew exactly what the virus was, and that it was, and the intention was hatched very early on. to develop an inoculation that would essentially reverse engineer the virus. He knew that it was engineered through the spike protein, so he reversed it by targeting the spike protein. He wanted to work with the company that specialized in mRNA technology, namely Moderna. So this was already on January 10th. Now, still, this doesn't mean that he's launched Plan B yet. He still is hoping that that it can still be just dismissed as an annual flu. So you can see the way he's working. It's like, I don't want to go to Plan B. Maybe Plan A is going to work. Nonetheless, Moderna starts working immediately with Barney Graham, and they he downloads the virus, and then he reports that on January 14th, Barney Graham's team starts to work on a vaccine in collaboration with Moderna. Still, this is not Plan B yet, but you can see that he was preparing for it. Now, also on January 14th, this is where it gets interesting. January 14th, we've got the CDC over there listening to Fauci all over the airwaves warning about a bad flu season, and they're just getting fed up with it because they're not seeing that there's any evidence in the data that there's a bad flu. It's exactly on track with all previous years. And Fauci reports that they had a private meeting at the CDC with Redfield and Nancy Messonnier. And if you know something about who she is, you'll recognize that name. She was the very first CDC official to brief the press on the coming lockdowns. This would have been in the middle of February, a month later. But at this point, she's meeting with other CDC players in private to cast some shade on Fauci. What's he doing this for? We're sick of this guy. So then they call him up and say, Tony, what's with this flu thing? We don't see any evidence of a flu. So this is basically when Plan A starts to unravel. He defends his decision. Well, it's better to warn about a bad flu. If it doesn't come, there's no harm done. But if we get a terrible flu season and we fail to warn about it, then we're the ones in trouble. So that was his sort of excuse. But now we have to fast forward to January 21. And this is I think, the turning point, because he says in his diary, the CDC announced today that the first case of COVID has been identified in Seattle. So you understand what this means, right? Plan A is over. We've got COVID here already. Something's got to happen. So that's when he shifts to Plan B. And you can see the announcement that happens just 5 days later on January 26th. That's when he puts in all caps in the entry. Game on, 3 exclamation points. Now, that's a very strange thing to say. And when I first read this in the diaries, I thought, I think this is significant, but I don't entirely understand what it is. Well, the game is something he had been working on in private with all of his colleagues, vaccine makers. DASIC of EcoHealth Alliance were likely responsible for funding the virus creation. The authorities in China. Everybody's working at CDC is, meanwhile, completely out of the loop, as far as I can tell. But Fauci knows what's going on. So he has to hatch the most audacious cover-up plan in essentially the history of humanity. He's got to get a product out, an injectable product that would serve as an inoculation that he would call a vaccine, working with new mRNA technology that had never previously been approved before by the FDA on grounds that it wasn't passing muster in terms of safety and effectiveness. But under emergency use authorization, with enough fear generated, then he could get that through. But the nature of respiratory viruses is that they're not stable. They're not stable like chickenpox or measles or smallpox. They're always changing, always mutating. And they mutate in part in response to rising population immunity, whether natural or injected. So he's got a major problem. We've never been able to vaccinate against, say, any other coronavirus, like, for example, the common cold, for this very reason. You can't get a shot out quickly enough to cover the variant that's in circulation. By the time the shot does come out, the variant has changed, the virus is mutated to something else that evades the immune response. So, this is the flaw in Fauci's plan B, which you could describe in broad terms, that he was going to convert his villainy into valor. He's going to become sainted and beatified by being the father of the cure. It's not a great plan, but it's the best he could do, all designed to sort of cover up his culpability. So you understand how this works, right? So the plan, as I mapped it out, was in 5 parts. First, he would have to crush the nasty rumors that this is a lab-created virus. That was easily accomplished by getting together some of his compliant scientists that he knows in his world to write a paper based on flim-flam or whatever, to completely rule out the possibility of lab leak, to say that it seems highly unlikely. We're the specialists, we'll get this thing out. That was already in play by February 1st. They had meetings with the authors of the paper. Fauci nudged them in the right direction. Not that he had to. They know exactly what they're supposed to say. These guys are all old hands at this work. That was the first one, to put the kibosh, as they say, on the rumors that this was created by a lab. It had to be a zoonotic spillover. Everybody get on the same page. This is zoonotic spillover. This is the kind of thing that's increasing due to industrialization. We have a large literature on this. It's not a problem. Everybody will believe it. Okay, that's the first part of Plan B. The second part is that he would arrange a junket to Wuhan. Now, this is an interesting one because they did, in fact, arrange this junket. It took place in mid-February, and he deputized his as an emissary, Clifford Lane, who's had a very, very close position, close to Fauci at NIAID, and was a trusted associate. So he would send him off to Wuhan under the auspices of the World Health Organization to observe all the ways in which China had successfully controlled this virus through brutal tactics like welding people in their homes, extreme quarantines, keeping people off the street, abolishing meetings, all these sorts of things that would have been impossible in a westernized country, but China did. So the purpose there was for the World Health Organization to go to China and observe the amazing way in which Xi Jinping handled the virus. What else they did in Wuhan, we can only speculate. Did they have contacts with the Institute of Virology? Did they clean up data? Did they plot and scheme to get on the same page about what they were doing? I don't entirely know, but I will say for the second part of this scheme, Fauci was pretty dedicated, because in his very first meeting with Trump that occurred within a few weeks of this, and the Oval Office, you have limited capital. You're meeting Trump. Trump now trusts you because everybody tells Trump they should trust Fauci. Fauci uses whatever limited capital he has with Trump and he reports this in the diary, to, on his next phone call with Xi Jinping, which was taking place that night or the next day, please ask Xi Jinping if he will welcome a delegation organized by the World Health Organization that would include people from the NIH, and also welcome trust in Britain and also European scholars and scientists to Wuhan. Now, how did this happen, and why did Trump have to make the request? Now, this is where it gets speculative, and I think it goes something like this. Tedros, the World Health Organization, was quite close to Xi Jinping, and was working very tightly with CCP at the time of these lockdown policies. And Tedros said, "Look, why don't we have a tour of, so everybody can discover what I know, which is that you're a great master of the microbial kingdom. We can invite some people from the U.S." Well, that's a problem for Xi Jinping because U.S. already had extreme travel restrictions in place against China, and yeah, that's a little bit offensive. So Xi says, "I'll do it, provided Trump personally asks me." So that's the limitation. That's the limiting factor. So Fauci has to get somebody to Wuhan. And this is the only way he could do it. So, being friendly with Trump, he says, "Mr. President, could you please, on your phone call with Xi Jinping, arrange for this trip to Wuhan?" And Trump did it. And Xi Jinping approved it. And it happened. And the World Health Organization came back with a glowing report about how wonderfully the Chinese people rallied together. And even though the methods were brutal, even though it seems extreme, even though nothing like this has ever been done in history to control a virus, China has seemingly accomplished this, and all countries of the world should copy this. That report, I believe, came out on February 24th. All right, so that was the second part of the game, the plan B, the game, as Fauci called it. And then number 3, Fauci would himself attempt coercion on a mass scale, just like China. And why? To slow population immunity to the new virus as a means of keeping seroprevalence levels as low as possible. And why would you need to do this? Because if you distribute a product labeled a vaccine, to a population that already had immunity by virtue of exposure, this doesn't mean that everybody gets sick, everybody gets well. It just means that the virus circulates, and at various levels of exposure, it could be a passing exposure to this is the way things work in evolution. I mean, like a passing exposure can trigger an immune response. Even with completely asymptomatic immune response. You don't have to be a case. You can be an infection and not even know it. You could just be a minor exposure, and seroprevalence levels are rising. And this is the way every single respiratory pandemic has ever unfolded in the history of the world. There's no reason to think this would be any different. So we're always on track. Even there's a hot moment, and then we arrive eventually at endemicity naturally through exposure. Now, this is going to be a problem for the vaccine product that he's putting out because, of course, the product would be made for wild type or whatever was circulating at the time. In this case, it was most likely the alpha strain. So that was the first iteration of the vaccine was made for the alpha strain. So you have to keep seroprevalence levels as low as possible. And you have to have various slogans to do this, otherwise the vaccine would serve no purpose and would fail to get the credit for having saved humanity. So number 4, he would try to get the injectable product to the population in record time, something that had never been done before. On grounds that doing so would be normally considered exceedingly risky. So he took recourse in this mRNA technology, which he knew well. He'd been working on mRNA since his time at AIDS, and he really wanted it out there. It's like it enables quick basically printing of an inoculation. If you have the sequence, you put it in the sequence, press print, out comes your potion, and you can reverse engineer whatever you engineered by targeting the spike protein of the virus using mRNA through lipid nanoparticles. So the technology is all there. So now is the chance to do it. And by doing this, you see what's going on. He wanted to outrun the virus. He wanted to get ahead of the mutations. This is all pretty audacious, wouldn't you agree? I mean, it's pretty, there's a lot to go wrong here. But hey, again, what are you going to do? Which finally gets us to the fifth point. He would shepherd the first ever deployment of a vaccine that focused entirely on the spike protein, essentially reverse engineering the virus using modified mRNA technology, and he would distribute it to the entire population at a breakneck speed. He figured he had go from the lab to the pharmacy. He figured he had 10 months. And would the virus mutate? Probably, but maybe it would work this time. Maybe we could get ahead of the virus and for the first time in the history of humanity, actually vaccinate against one of these fast-moving, fast-mutating respiratory viruses before endemicity arrived. So you can see that this was actually a pretty outrageous plan, and you can also see the slogans that they came up with. It's fairly brilliant. Flatten the curve. Okay, so and you remember the curves. Like here's what happens if everybody gets infected. We have a lot of death. But if everybody stays apart, wears masks, stands in front of plexiglass, avoids all meetings, cancel religious holidays, no travel. Track and trace anybody who's sick, make them isolate themselves, reduce exposure of the population to this virus. That will prolong the period of the initial phases of the pandemic as long as possible. So the vaccine would get there. That was the plan all along. It wasn't, in other words, for your health. It was to prolong the pain of the first period and reduce population. It was far from being for your health. It was designed to prolong the period in which you did not have access to the solution naturally through exposure, the way it's always happened in the past. Instead, we would entirely rely on artificial means, and therefore Fauci would both get the credit and never be blamed for having created the virus in the first place. That was Plan B. And that, I think, was the idea all along. And that's what 15 days to slow the spread was. We'll do that for 15 days, and then we'll go back to Trump. Ask for an additional 30 days. That's exactly what happened. And so Fauci, even from the very beginning, and actually Deborah Birx confirms this in her account, they had every intention of prolonging this as long as possible. They wanted to wait to the shot, while using artificial mechanisms of lockdowns, shutdowns, school closures, business closures, everything else, just bare subsistence of society. Unessential workers stay home. They can disappear. Essential workers can work from home, or so we do need medical professionals. We need people delivering food. They're also essential. Let's just reduce social functioning down to its bare minimum and slow down and slow down the period, prolong the early stage of the pandemic as long as possible. There were other excuses too, like, well, we need to save hospital space. I mean, that worked for a little while because of all the overcrowding in New York, which itself might have been, that whole period is slightly suspicious because there was a lot of people directed to just two hospitals when there were many more available. Many of the others were empty, but these were overcrowded. News media was all over it, right? You remember the freezer trucks, the boat that rocked up to New York, which remained empty, by the way. This mobile hospital was empty. So we had to create the appearance of overcrowding Whereas in most of the country, people are looking at their hospitals going, nobody's here. I'm not sure I see a pandemic happening. But nonetheless, that was another excuse. Well, we want everybody to stay home so we don't have hospital overcrowding. Well, that didn't last very long. People caught on to that pretty quickly because you can always drive down the street and look and notice and see that nobody's at your hospital. Also, the nurses started making dance videos, bored out of their minds because they didn't have any patients. Crazy stuff. But all the slogans were designed to underscore this sort of plan B, flatten the curve. 15 days to slow the spread. Now, Trump gets onto this in the diaries. You can see that by the April 23rd, Trump is on to the fact that something doesn't seem quite right. The economy has collapsed. The stock market's collapsed. Everybody's mad. People are staying home. Easter's not happening, and Trump blamed Fauci and Birx for this. Fauci wasn't there, but he blamed Birx, and she reported this to Fauci, who says, "Look, don't worry about it. There's nothing Trump can do at this point," because Fauci was working to make himself famous. He was working to make himself a sort of a folk hero of the period. It was all a myth, but the press caught on to it because they were playing a little game. Like the more they love Fauci, the more they can sort of hate on Trump. That was the way it worked. Well, so how does this end up? I mean, in the end, we know that this didn't work because by the time the shot was released, and even before it was able to get to the shelves at your local pharmacy, before you had access to it, David Ho, a virologist from the UK, writes Fauci a note, and again, Fauci puts it in his diary. We've got a new variant, and that variant is Delta. And I'm seeing less effectiveness from the shot. In fact, it's falling dramatically. Then a week later, he says, look, if this keeps up, the shot's going to be completely useless. Something Fauci knew. He knew it for sure from the 9th of January, even before you could even get access to the shot, that the shot was no longer pertained. And Fauci even says in passing, we're going to have to get a reformulated shot here, which he probably assumed would happen in the boosters. Why the booster would stay ahead of the mutations, I don't know why he believed this, but again, what other choices he have? So he knew that it was not going to be effective, and safety and all those kind of questions were out the window anyway. That was not even a consideration at all. It was maybe a slogan, but it was not a serious consideration. It just wasn't part of the mix. Now, if you look back at the way things unfolded in 2020, the grand plot to delay endemicity, to restrain seroprevalence to its lowest possible levels by keeping the infection rate down as low as possible, the pace at which the virus moves through the community, through lockdowns. Nobody's really ever tried to do this in exactly this way before, so Fauci had no evidence that it would ever work. But everything began to blow up pretty early on. 2 weeks after lockdowns began on March 16th, 2020, a epidemiologist, economist, and scientist and MD from Stanford University named Bhattacharya got to work within 2 weeks on his own seroprevalence study. And, you know, he used family members, he used whatever money he could. He was desperate to get out there and test people, essentially give a titer test to the population of Santa Clara, which is close by. There was no evidence of any community spread within Santa Clara. There wasn't anything in the news about this, which made it even more ideal. I mean, Jay wanted to know what is the rate of population immunity even before we have evidence of any cases in Santa Clara. And you see what happens. This is called good science. He had an intuition. He had an intuition that there's a lot more population immunity to this virus than people think. At the time, the model was we're pure, clean human beings, but a very bad wave of pathogens is coming our way. If we're powerful and resilient enough and do all the right things, stay 6 feet apart and dance around in a big kabuki dance, stand with a mask, walk with walk with a mask, sit without it, all these things, douse ourselves with hand sanitizer enough, we can keep the bad pathogen away. This is a very primitive, almost medieval understanding of the way these things work. Jay Bhattacharya understands the microbial kingdom is much more dynamic. People can get exposed to the virus, can be everywhere, and nobody really know it. It's just something that's part of the world, and nobody can really control it. It's really outside our capacity to control these kinds of viruses. And so he was just curious, like, I'd like to know. So he did. He conducted the survey. Well, the results came in a few weeks later, and it turned out that there's quite a lot of immunity already existing within the population, 10 times what anybody had believed. Still very low. It was a little above 1%, I believe, but still, that was for having that level of population-based immunity and the complete absence of any news of the virus even in the community is quite striking. So he went to print with this. Well, you can see that this kind of study is kind of a catastrophe for Fauci's plan, because it suggests that the virus is far more widespread than we thought. The infection fatality rate was much lower. It's much lower than people were saying. We're not looking at a fatality rate of 2 or 3% like the World Health Organization was saying, or 1%, as Fauci was saying, 10 times worse than the flu, but rather something on the order of a normal seasonal flu, maybe a bad flu. Because the virus is far more widespread, and the more widespread it is, the lower the infection fatality rate is going to be. It's just simple math. The study confirmed all of Jay's hypotheses about this virus, and also implicitly said that lockdowns cannot work. Santa Clara had been locked down for 2 weeks already when the study was occurred, but the seroprevalence levels were already high and rising. So, much to his shock, Jay was treated with an incredibly ferocious media campaign against him. I mean, it's actually kind of unbelievable, and he couldn't even believe it himself, that it seemed like everybody was going after the study. There was at the time a publication named BuzzFeed that dug through the study and found out that it was funded in part by, I don't know, a friend that Jay had who owned JetBlue or something. He threw a little bit of money at the study just out of curiosity, and they accused Jay of being in the pay of corporations. It was just like an unbelievable smear that appeared on the cover of BuzzFeed, treating Jay as a bad guy. But you can see now why this had to happen, why this happened. Fauci was, I can't prove it, but I'm guessing that Fauci or one of his henchmen, he had many people in on this at the time. Basically, they went to their kept journals and venues that are infiltrated by deep state control and so on, and shut it down. And that was also the beginning of the deployment of the new censorship. This was also part of Plan B, was to shut down all critics, anybody who would say things like, we can get through this thing normally and naturally. And there's nothing that lockdowns are going to do to stop this virus from sweeping through the population and thereby upgrading our immune response long before the vaccine could ever get there. I hope you're following the way this thing works. I mean, the plan is so audacious and so crazy, brilliant, unlikely to work. And I mean, just keeping it together for all this time required censorship. I mean, you had to, because it was so crazy. So you had to just shut people down who were talking about the lab leak, who were talking about natural immunity, who were talking about the basics of immunology and any sort of science that we all knew the day before yesterday, the impossibility of using a vaccine in the case of coronavirus. These kinds of comments were just not permitted. And so this was something of a catastrophe for him, but for Fauci, but it was, again, the best that he could do. So in the end, the vaccine was dead on arrival already. But he had successfully created enough fear in the population to increase the demand for the shots. And several seroprevalence studies were actively shut down that were already taking place in late 2020. There was one in South Dakota that was showing seroprevalence levels already at 40 and 60%. Now, South Dakota, there was a lot of exposure because they didn't have any lockdowns. Whether and to what extent the lockdowns actually make a difference is, I think, a debatable question in terms of the virus, the time and place of the virus and circumstances. A lot of unknowns here. But certainly in South Dakota, they didn't have any lockdowns. Seroprevalence was risen to very high levels. I mean, to the point that you don't need a vaccine, under these conditions. We've gotten through it and through natural exposure. I don't mention this in the article, but there are other things that are part of this plot. Like, for example, it wasn't just talk about natural immunity that was banned. They had heavily targeted other normal therapeutics you would use for a respiratory pandemic like this. Like, for example, hydroxychloroquine or ivermectin, which is very powerful for the secondary infections. And we know all this stuff from later research, but you didn't even need to do the research. You know this from tradition, that these kinds of things, chloroquine and ivermectin, which had won the Nobel Prize in Medicine, would have been great for this virus. But those all had to be taken off the shelf. Where I lived, and by this period, maybe even it was a year later, I couldn't get ivermectin or hydroxychloroquine anywhere. They weren't even being distributed by locally owned family pharmacies. The Northeast was it was impossible to get these things unless you had a friend who had a friend who got a shipment from India or whatever the thing was. I mean, so that was also part of the plan. I probably should have put that in the article, but it all so in a strange, perverse way, the whole thing makes sense once you understand what was actually going on. In any case, the vaccine comes out. It clearly didn't work. Fauci never mentioned this to anybody. In fact, he said the opposite and had all of his henchmen deputized to go on the media and say, if you get the vaccine, you're not going to get sick, which was just a flat out lie, and everybody knew that. Later on, he tried to stop Rochelle Walensky, who was now at the CDC, from going public with the fact that the vaccine did not stop transmission. So what was his plan then? Well, that's when the boosters came into play. Okay, we'll distribute a booster for the new variant. Oh, well, now there's a new variant. What are we going to do about that? And so on it went. And of course, every mutation got less virulent, by the time we get to Omicron, which in a way served as its own vaccination, very low level exposure, not really fatal, a very low rate of low case fatality rate with Omicron. The vaccine is no longer necessary if it ever was. But that's the thing. It never actually worked to do what Fauci had hoped. So this was already 3 years ago. And you consider the fullness of what transpired here. It's utterly beyond belief. So now we're in this weird situation. Jeremy Farrar, who was in on this thing, if not from the beginning, pretty early on, we're talking about from late January, got promoted up to be the head scientist of the World Health Organization, who just this morning, as I'm making this little podcast, was pushed into retirement. He's been vanished. David Morens has pleaded guilty to hiding documents, shredding documents. And Fauci's diaries are out, so we can see everything. And now I've done a very close read of these. And the story I just told, it's not obvious from reading it, but if you know everything else around it and overlay this model on top of the diaries, everything will suddenly make sense to you. You'll see. I invite you to do so. There's another way in which the diaries are kind of, I would say, like devastating from a PR point of view. Part of his goal here was to pad his resume with awards to bolster his reputation with connections with movie stars, to be adored by the media, to only conduct super friendly interviews, to make himself invulnerable to attack. Like the more he could surround himself by fans, the more baseball cards and cupcakes and posters and T-shirts with "Thank you, Anthony Fauci" that could be printed, the more he could protect himself from what he feared from very early on. And I'm talking about October 2019, if not earlier, would ultimately be his fate, which is that he'd be blamed for the pandemic by his conducting of gain-of-function research that got out of hand. So that's been his great plight for the better part of 7 years now. If you think about it, 7 years of hell for this guy, and everything else can be read through that lens. But now we've got David Morens, who's got his own sort of interesting history in this regard. He was always at the top of his profession, a clever writer, co-authored many papers with Anthony Fauci along the way. But his boss, Fauci, had pressed him into service on this scheme about which he knew everything, and he went along at every step. The shredding of the documents, and the cover-ups, and everything else. And he was kind of these 7 years drove David into complete despair and sadness. You can take one look at him and know it. And he's, I would say, based on what I read from his emails and what I know about him, he's probably super relieved to having pled guilty in exchange for a lighter sentence. He's scheduled to get 5 years. Maybe it'll be suspended. Maybe he'll serve just a little bit of time, but he's going to probably talk and rat out everybody else. And there's a whole another tranche of emails we're expecting from David's side of things, because he created several private email addresses. We haven't seen those yet. Those are all probably coming out. So essentially, the end times are here for the COVIDian plotters. And what's striking about this case to me, and I opened with this remark, it wasn't just about Fauci. He wasn't alone in this thing. He's cooperated with military intelligence, who didn't want any evidence of this virus being traced to gain-of-function research and the cooperation of the Wuhan Institute of Virology. They didn't want that. And all the people who cooperated with Fauci. Fauci was a very powerful guy. He pulled every lever. So we got all big tech involved in the censorship operations too, and Google and YouTube at the time said, If you say anything that contradicts the World Health Organization, the World Health Organization, we will delete your video. And of course, Twitter, which is captured in many ways, played along with this entirely, partially due to government pressure, but also, I don't know, the political constellation of events at the time really came down to this. You can love Trump or you can love Fauci. If you don't like Trump, you have to love Fauci and say everything he says, since he is the science. That was the prevailing view for years in the mainstream media, almost universally, and big tech played along with this. Then you have the problem of the pharmaceutical industry itself, which is its credibility has taken an unprecedented blow with the distribution of these unworkable, and it turns out, unsafe shots. Far more reports to VAERS from this one shot than every other product ever listed in VAERS reporting systems combined. Many dead. The injuries are everywhere, and I don't have time to go into what Fauci knew and when he knew it, but he knew early on about the problems associated with mRNA penetrating the fetal membrane and the problem of rising miscarriages, especially from those people who took it took the shot the first trimester, which he had recommended. So you see, these lies are everywhere, and in a strange way, they still are. If you put anything I've said right now into a common AI engine and ask about it, AI would be glad to debunk it at every single step or pedifog you on all the details. So we're not anywhere near coming to the fullness of what we're going to find out. I think what I've laid out for you in this video is the actual story. I think this is it. There's probably more going on. There's a political element to this. There's always people wanting to use a crisis to gain power, try out their new tools, track and trace, lead into digital ID. You can tell the story in many, many ways. And, I have people say, well, maybe this is in the end about population control and eugenics. Maybe. Tell whatever terrible story you want. Maybe they're all true. I don't know. But the main structure of how this thing unfolded in the mind of the leading spokesman for the lockdowns and then the ultimate vaccine salesman in the English-speaking world was Anthony Fauci. And we've got the documents. And we can trace through his thought, his line of thinking. What you experience here is a kind of, it can only be explained on a spiritual level, I would say, because the one thing you never find in any of these diaries is any sympathy for the victims of lockdowns or for the vaccine injured. It's just not a word about the students who are suffering at home, spinning and going crazy. The people locked inside the houses, the people who had friends at Alcoholics Anonymous that they depend on to go see every single day to keep them sober, keep their world intact, suddenly denied access to that. Millions of people. The way in which Fauci divided families by vaccine status. 5 cities in this country were segregated by vaccine status. If you didn't comply with a shot, you could not get a beer at a bar, go to the library, or go to the theater to the extent they had them at all. 5 cities in this country, 5 of the biggest cities, were segregated by vaccine status, even though Fauci and many, many others knew that there was nothing that the shot was doing to contribute to public health, because it was not stopping infection. It was not stopping the spread. And in any case, I've never understood this idea of keeping the vaccinated away from the unvaccinated. It's like a moment's thought would make you realize something. If the vaccine was effective, you wouldn't need to worry about being around the unvaccinated. But how does that even make sense? I mean, implicitly, the idea of segregating the city by vaccine status is an admission that the shot doesn't work. In any case, it was all just part of the coercion and the intimidation campaign. And just talking about it now makes me crazy furious all over again. There's so much more to say, my friends. I thought I would just give you a preview of how I'm understanding what happened. And I'm really happy to hear your version of events and any correctives. You can write me at Brownstone Institute. I also post on X all the time. We're in for some exciting days ahead as we discover the truth. All the best, my friends.